This panel is going to discuss one of the biggest and one of the hottest issues in education policy today, namely charters. As Roland Fryer's paper points out, and I really urge everyone to read it if you haven't yet had a chance to do so, it's really quite important and excellent. As it points out, charters are perhaps the most important innovation in public education over the past generation in the United States. But there are many myths and many misconceptions about charters and about the motivations and the goals of many in the charter movement. You saw some of that play out in the recent Chicago teachers' strike. Beyond that, there are just many people in the United States who think that charters are either an unmitigated good or, alternatively, an existential threat. And the reality is that they are neither of those. Now, we're exceedingly fortunate to have Roland Fryer with us today, and I'm just going to introduce Roland before I introduce the rest of the panel after he finishes. The Hamilton Project has done considerable work with Roland over the last couple of years. We're very fortunate to have been able to do that. As I said, he's prepared really quite an extraordinary paper, which he's going to summarize. I just would say that Roland's resume is a little hard to read. You think that must be some fake or something like that. How could anybody have done so much so quickly? I particularly want to know what a titanium lion is, but I won't dwell on that here. But he is doing extraordinarily important and vital and groundbreaking work in this subject, and I'm just going to reveal my own bias right at the outset here. If we are going to ever turn around the decline in median incomes in this country and actually get back to raising living standards for Americans, we are only going to do that by lifting up and truly changing public education in this country. That's the only way that's ever going to be achieved. So with that, let me just introduce Roland. And he's going to summarize his paper. Apparently he's going to do 34 slides in 7 minutes. As you know, I think you can take a little more than that, but please, we're happy to have you, Roland.
Thank you very much, Roger, and it's great to be here again and to see so many familiar faces in the audience and on the panel. Michael Greenstone, who's the director of the Hamilton Project, emailed me this morning and asked that I speak for an hour, and I don't think I should do that, so I'm going to try to do it in 7 minutes or so, Michael, okay? Slides are up somewhere. Oh, there we go. Start without them. Oh, I got it. Okay. Good morning. So, how you been? We all know that education in America, the statistics show that our performance has been flat over the last 30 to 40 years. Okay, and if you just look at the latest statistics of how many schools didn't make AYP, I believe it's 48% of schools didn't make AYP in 2011. If you look at the NAEP data, the National Association of Education Progress, it shows that roughly 40% of our 8th graders are proficient in math or in reading. One of the things about NAEP that's most disturbing to me is that of all the school districts that participate in NAEP, there is not one of them in which more than 25% of Black or Hispanic students are proficient in math or in reading. And in fact, in places like Detroit, roughly 3% are proficient. So over breakfast this morning, I tried to calculate how many kids that might be. It's roughly 132 that are proficient in math in a place like Detroit. So over the past few years, we have I have tried to figure out through lots of failures and a tiny bit of progress what we can actually do about those facts. Okay? And roughly 2 years ago, I stumbled on the work of Jeffrey Canada in the Harlem Children's Zone. And when we did his evaluation, I was pretty blown away to see that after 4 years, his students who were lotteried in, good for them, sucks for the people who were lotteried out, after 4 years, he had erased the achievement gap in math between the average black student who applied for his lottery and the average white student in all of New York City. And he had cut in a third the gap in English language arts. And I thought that was real progress. And I wanted to understand how we could do that for all kids, right? And so we went, and it reminds me of really my grandmother's baking. I see a lot of people in the audience. I'm sure you can cook well, but I'm pretty certain you have nothing on my grandmother. And at least I need to say that on C-SPAN just in case she's watching. But at any rate, my grandmother makes this absolutely fabulous coconut cake. Okay, and one Christmas I was kind of alone in Cambridge, and I thought, well, I'm feeling the holiday blues. I want to make my grandmother's coconut cake as well. My grandmother was an educator for 37 years. My great aunt, who also raised me, was an educator for 51 years. And I called my grandmother and I said, hey, I want to make your cake. And she said, oh, it's really simple. You start with 2 cups of sugar. You boil it until it spins a thread. I said, come again? And she gave me directions that sounded kind of like people who run great charters like Seth say when you ask them how they run their school. I said, a cup of this, a palm of that. I said, whose palm, what cup? At any rate, around Thanksgiving, I went to my grandmother's house, and I just annoyed the hell out of her in the kitchen, frankly. But she would grab like flour with her hand, and I would put a cup underneath, and I would sprinkle the flour in, and I backed out the recipe. Again, it annoyed her, but I have a recipe that I can now give my children and my grandchildren. So we spent 2 years trying to do something like that with charter schools. Okay, the average charter school is no better than the average traditional public school. I don't want you to get that fact wrong. That's an important fact. But what's interesting about charters is that there's a huge right tail of charter schools that are doing phenomenal things for kids, just phenomenal things for kids. There's a left tail of that distribution that if I weren't with you, I'd probably try to be shutting them down this morning because they're not doing good things at all for kids. But as an economist, what we wanted to do, kind of like my grandmother's recipe, we said, wow, there's a distribution. These people are freed up to make choices, right? No one remembers that the second promise of charter schools was to be an incubator for best practices that could be then used in public schools. So we took this freedom and this variance in the outcomes, and we really just wanted to understand what makes some good and others not so good. And essentially we found that 5 things explain 50% of the variance in what makes some charter schools good and others not so good. Now, 50% of the variance. Some of you may be saying, wow, you're at Harvard and you can only explain 50%. Others of you may be saying, wow, if I could explain 50% of the daily variations in the stock market, we could own a few islands. Thank you. I was dying up here, man. So we use this data to come up with these 5 things. Now, I'm going to say them, and I don't want you to leave the room. Just bear with me, okay? And this is all off. Okay. I think it's like a cruise ship. I'm a couple moves behind, but all right. I don't want you to leave the room when I say them. So the first one was how often schools gave teachers feedback, okay? Feedback on their instructional practice. The second one was how they actually used data to drive and alter the pace and scope of instruction. Now, we talk about data a lot in schooling and education reform right now. In fact, there's so much data, it actually might be a liability more than an asset in some schools. In fact, I'm pretty sick of data walls at this point. What's interesting about the effective schools that use data was that they not only plastered it over the wall so the visitors could see, but what they also did was you could talk to the teachers and they knew how to alter their lesson plans and instruction as a function of the information they were getting in, okay? The third thing was how they broke students down into very small groups of tutoring, like groups of 6 or less for 4 or more days per year. The fourth thing was just instructional time. And the fifth thing was high expectations and really a no excuses culture. And that's pretty personal to me because high expectations, I think, are very, very important. I'll just tell you one tiny story. They're already giving me the... when I was 15 and I went to my high school, my father had just gone to prison over the weekend, or been convicted over the weekend. And I went to school on Monday like it was a regular old Monday. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny or flippant, but in my neighborhood, you know, one guy went in, it was just not that big of a deal, okay? So I went to school, and my guidance counselor, who was the most well-meaning guy around, came up to me and, you know, had these kind of sad eyes, right? And he said, Roland, we saw what was in the newspaper, and we just think this is awful. And I said, oh, sir, it's not so bad. And he said, well, we were thinking, given the extraordinary circumstances that happened, you shouldn't have to come to school all day. I said, you know what? It was kind of bad. And he said, yeah, man, we got this new program. You can come to school at 8, and you can go home at noon. And I said, you know, it's so bad, sir, I was thinking 10:30. High expectations. If you talk to the leaders of these effective schools that we surveyed, the kids will live up or down to whatever expectations we have for them. So what we did was we looked around the country for someone willing to let us implement these 5 things, and frankly, it was very, very difficult. This is difficult stuff to do. And then I ran into Terry Grier. I knew I was going to get married 2 years ago. I just had no idea it was going to be to Terry Grier. We're still honeymooning, aren't we? Yeah. And so we implemented these 5 tenets in 20 of the lowest performing schools with Terry in Houston, and 7 of the lowest performing schools in Denver. And I'm just going to show you the results quickly, and I'm going to shut up. So on the slide here, you have the Harlem Children's Zone results. These results, just again, for context, the math results are enough to eliminate the achievement gap in 4 years. The reading results are enough to reduce it by a third around in the same time period. Then I have the average KIPP school done by an evaluation by Mathematica. And then I have the Houston and I have the Denver first year results up there. Will this continue? How do you continue it? How do you scale it? All that I'm sure that I'll be beat up in a second about. But what it shows is that you can take these strategies, these basic strategies of teacher feedback, teacher professional development, which I'm a huge proponent of, implement them in regular traditional public schools where people do not sign up for lotteries, where you take the kids you get. You know, folks always ask me, Roland, shouldn't the 6th tenet be parental involvement? And maybe it does, but I don't want folks to use it as an excuse. Terry and I tell the folks in Houston all the time, the parents are sending you the best kids they got, they're not hiding the good ones at home. Now, you may be thinking, hey, that's just test scores. We're not interested in test scores. And I'm with you. I'm a little worn thin on test scores as well. We have just completed a bit of a longitudinal survey of medium-term outcomes of the kids from the Harlem Children's Zone who went through in 2004 and 2005. So with the generous help of the Ford Foundation, we spent $1 million tracking down 500 of their first cohort kids. And these are other outcomes that we're observing in the data from the impact of attending this school. Okay, so all I want you to see here is that Harlem Children's Zone and Denver and Houston Year 1 have very similar results, and we don't have these medium-term outcomes from Houston or Denver. It's still too early, but we do have them from the Harlem Children's Zone. What you see is that there's an 80% increase in who took the SAT, a 60% increase in being accepted to college. Other outcomes are also positive. I want to point to 2 of them, which I think are both phenomenal and distressing to me at the same time. Number 1, pregnancy. So we tracked it down. Just imagine this for a second. April 14th, 2005, kids sit in an auditorium in Harlem, in central Harlem. Half of the girls get a ticket to go to a high-quality school. The other half go to whatever school they're going to go to. 7 years later, the ones who didn't go to that school are 5 times more likely to be pregnant. For the boys, those who did not go to that school are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated. Okay, so this is not just about test scores, right? I totally agree with the folks that say high test scores for kids who are in danger or likely to be in prison, right? Not so interesting, right? A bunch of kids who know the Pythagorean theorem but are locked up, I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in are these types of long-term outcomes. So in the end, these three pieces of evidence give me incredible optimism and a concrete proposal for how I think we can move forward. It's not perfect. We need a lot of work on reading. Terry will tell you, we think we're on the 40-yard line with 60 yards to go. But we have these three pieces of evidence. One, we have a sense of what makes some schools effective and others not. We haven't all figured it out. I told you, 50% of the variance. Second, we know that if you take these things, there's nothing special about them being implemented in charter schools. When you take them and put them in traditional public schools, you get similar results. And third, those test score results, at least in one sample, seem to lead to better outcomes. So the proposal on the table here is to take the bottom 5% of schools to implement these strategies. Let's just at least come together for those, because those are the kids who are the most vulnerable. We can argue, I mean, I'm in Harvard, that's all we do. We can argue over the other 95% all day long, but let's take the 5% in the bottom, try to do these strategies to turn those kids around, because there's 3 million kids in those schools. All right? Thank you.
We're joined on the panel by Terry again, to my immediate left, by Seth Andrew to my right. Seth is the founder of the very successful democracy prep schools in New York, which were founded in 2005 and have been a model for a number of the things Roland has discussed. And by Richard Rothstein on my far right, who is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and also at the Warren School of Policy and Law at Berkeley Law School, and has published very extensively on education, and very importantly. I'm going to start with Terry, if I may. One of the most important things Roland effectively just said, and certainly his paper says, I think at least, is the great promise of charters is that they provide us certain lessons as to what works, and Roland has identified 5, which can then be ideally deployed in district schools or traditional public schools. And by the way, I might point out, Roland's paper says that if you tried to actually, if your goal was to have every public school child in America in a charter school, it would take 100 years to do it at the current rate. So that's obviously not a viable goal, nor is that the goal of most people in the charter movement, I might add. But in any event, my question, Terry, is where does yours and Roland's experiment in Houston go from here? What additional time, and you both might comment on this if I could, what additional time is required in those 20 schools to prove out the points that Roland you just made? And if they do prove out, what would it take, and what are the chances of doing it, to extend these 5 practices a lot more widely in Houston? And Terry, if you would start with that.
Well, it's hard work. There's no question about the fact that it's hard work. I know in talking to Jeff about his experiences in Harlem, it's like after the 3rd or 4th year, he just went in and fired everybody and started kind of essentially over again. This is hard work. And you're basically talking about a shift in culture, and you're talking about a major shift in expectations. These schools did not get this bad overnight. Many of these schools were failing schools 12 years ago, 15 years ago, and yet we didn't have the political will to do things that we're talking about doing here to change this. So change in public education is tough. That's one of the reasons I think you don't see a lot of success in some of the charters. Some of the charters have basically just kept doing the same thing that the people that were running them did before they became charters. And the effective charters like Seth's schools, you have innovative, creative leaders that are not going to keep the status quo. It's in our school district, we're spending about $2,000 more per student in these charter schools, in our Apollo 20 schools than we do in our traditional schools. We added an hour to the school day. We have tutors who tutor all 6th and 9th graders in math, 70 minutes a day, 1 tutor per 2 students. These kids go to school 2 weeks longer. It takes more money. What people, I think, sometimes forget about public education is that it just simply no longer can be a one-size-fits-all model. Some kids simply need more time. They need more help. One of the things that we struggle with, Roland will tell you, in Houston, when we turn around these schools, we required all the teachers to reapply. We replaced as many as 80% of the teachers in some of those schools. We replaced all the principals and the assistant principals. One of our big challenges is to find the human capital, teachers that can go in with a missionary zeal and teach these children and have these high expectations and have the ability to be able to differentiate learning to the degree that we need to in these schools has been a big challenge for us, and it's something that takes a lot of political will to do. What I worry about sometimes is finding enough of the talent that we need long term. Now in Denver, Roland has an idea that he started a school up there where they're doing a lot more tutoring. It's almost a tutoring school, which is getting some interesting results, and we want to find out more about that as well. But we in education have got to get away from this idea that we fund schools on a per pupil basis. I happen to think that Roland's talking about this bottom 5%. I think the bottom 15% in all states, those children ought to be funded at a much higher level. But you ought to hold superintendents and school boards accountable for how those dollars are spent, making sure you're getting a good investment on the return. One of our biggest criticisms people have said to me is that, well, how are you going to sustain this long term when this 3-year program is up? We've raised about $18 million through our Houston Independent School District Foundation to fund this program. We've spent some local and state dollars, but the bulk of it has been through money that's been raised. Well, someone said to me, it's not sustainable. And the person that said this to me was one of the big supporters, financial supporters of our effective charter schools in Houston. I said, do you want to tell me how long that charter network could be sustained if you didn't raise money? If you weren't giving $1 million a year of your dollars to it and others weren't giving money, how long could Seth's school be sustained if he wasn't having to go out and raise money? Now, it simply, and I'm not critical of that, I think it's absolutely sad that he has to do that. The children he's educating require more time, they require more assistance, more tutoring. They're doing a phenomenal job. It's one of the best charter networks, if not the best in the country. But why should he have to, and why should Jeff Canada have to go raise that kind of money to educate these children down at the bottom? All of our children deserve a quality education, all of them. Some just take more time, some take more resources and more energy.
Okay, I want to turn to Seth. Seth, just tell us more about the Democracy Prep schools. Tell us how many there are. Tell us the mix between elementary and other levels. Tell us a little bit about the last point Terry was talking about, which is a really important one in this debate, namely cost. How much are you spending beyond what district schools spend, and how are you financing that?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And Democracy Prep started, as you said, in 2005, has consistently been now the highest performing charter network in New York City on the Chancellor's Progress Report, which is a metric that primarily looks at student growth over time, which is one of the reasons that Dr. Frier's research is so powerful, is that what he's looking at is the growth, the impact that a school would have on the scholars who get into our school by a random lottery rather than those who don't. So we're proud of the growth our kids made, but there's a long way to go. Our first kids have not yet graduated college. They're about to graduate this year. I have Jade and Omar with me today, who are in the college class of 2018, but you'll note that that's a long time away still. So we have to measure the metrics that Roland is talking about to make sure this works long term. We have a lot of early indicators that look good. And Roland's research shows that, and the Chancellor's research shows that. But what we actually have tried to do at Democracy Prep is something different than that's been done before. So I just want to shift right to this funding question. What we've done at Democracy Prep is taken the great work that's happened at charter schools before us. And charter schools, just to reiterate what Roland said, on the whole, charter schools suck. So I want everybody just to hear that from the guy on the panel who's supposed to support charter schools.
How do you spell that?
S-U-C-K. And that's an important thing to note, but that's not why we have public charter schools. Public charter schools are the innovation laboratory for American public education to figure it out. And even if we assume that the Credo study is right and 50%, 70% are equal to or worse than district schools, what we're finding at some schools, and that's why Dr. Frier's paper is so powerful, has the ability, if scaled, and there's a big if there, to impact the lives of the 3 million kids that we're talking about today. The thing that I think a lot of people say is the barrier is the one that you've just raised, and Terry, I'm going to unfortunately disagree with you, is money. Money is not the issue. And anybody who leaves here thinking that money is the issue is not listening carefully enough. Democracy Prep spends less money per pupil than New York City public schools, spends less money per pupil than charter schools in New York, and get this, once we open, from day one, we don't need a single dollar of philanthropy to run our schools. And I would actually argue one of the reasons we have done so well is because my focus has not been on philanthropy. I don't raise money. I don't have to talk to you, to anybody else to raise money. I can actually just go and focus on running great schools. The talent problem that Terry talks about is the problem. We don't have enough great leaders. We don't have the principals, the school leaders, the teachers, the grade level leaders in this country right now in a pipeline of the caliber we need to grow to serve 3 million kids right now. So that's where I see the biggest barrier in scaling this up, is not in money. We spend less money and can do it on public funds. Let me just give you one quick example so you walk away thinking about it in concrete terms. America spends about $10,000 per pupil on education per year, on average. That's a lot of money. That means that a classroom of 25 kids spends $250,000 a year. Where's that money going? Let's hire a teacher and pay him $75,000 a year like we do. Let's hire another teacher for that same classroom and pay him another $75,000 like we do. Let's put in benefits. We're up to $200,000 a year. And then let's say, okay, we also need some administrators and some extra support outside of that. But we're barely at $250,000. And in New York, I get $13,500 of public dollars off the top. So where is the money going if we're not spending it on these 5 things that Roland's talking about? Higher quality talent, more time, more rigor and high expectations, really joyous culture. We have 97% attendance, not because we force it, but because our kids want to be in school. It's safe, it's clean, and that's where their friends are. Right? So that's where they want to be every day, because we have theater, art, and music, and all of the things that get cut out if you have a 6-hour day like Chicago. We have a 10-hour day. But that means that every kid gets all of the things that get cut out if you have a 6-hour day. And so we can have the things that middle-class schools or rich schools think about as after school. We just put them in the day and build them in for every kid. So this is a solvable problem. This is a scalable problem. The things that is a scalable solution. The thing that is missing is the political will. And so the last thing I'll say is that we are democracy prep for a reason as opposed to generic prep. And the reason we are democracy prep and not generic prep is that what we have right now, more than a problem of education, is a problem of our politics, which are fundamentally broken. The democracy that we live in is fundamentally broken when we don't have enough people like Terry Grier and others standing up with the political will to say we're going to try this, we're going to figure out how to do this, we're going to take big risks, and we're going to try to get these 3 million kids in the nation's worst schools to college and beyond, and most of all, to become great citizens so they can help fix the democracy that right now is broken for most of them. So there's that.
Richard, I want to ask you about this issue of cost and money and so forth. And Seth just made the point that that's really not the issue at all. And you can extrapolate his point and take Roland's analysis, which shows essentially that the 5 initiatives, Roland, if I'm right, cost about $1,800 a year per student. And you can say there are 3 million students, and therefore it would cost $6 billion a year in the United States to actually implement those for the 3 million students. And while that's not a trivial sum, it's really not a large sum by the standards of the federal budget as standards of US GDP right now. So if you would comment on this whole question of cost, because many of the people who don't like charters say, you know, that's just a bunch, I mean, we hear this every single day of the week, that's just a bunch of wealthy people, you know, sculpting education the way they want it to be.
Well, let me say first that the major issue in school funding these days, the phenomenal growth in per pupil spending that we've noticed over the last 3 or 4 decades is primarily attributable to special education, not to the kinds of things that Seth was talking about in a typical classroom. What we've done in this country over the last 40 years is we've made a commitment to educate, to the extent possible, children who 40 years ago were institutionalized, were taken care of at home, who were not in school. And so the biggest share of the growth in per pupil spending over the last 40 years in this country has been special education, not regular education. But let me, if I may, you'll forgive me, but I am not as enthusiastic about Roland's presentation and Seth's presentation as you are. It disturbs me greatly. And the reason it disturbs me is that it drives off a theory of American education, which I find to be flawed. And there's a frenzy in this country now around this theory. Roland began by citing it. He said that our schools, our education outcomes have been stagnant. Outcomes have been declining. It wasn't always so, his paper says. It used to be much better. And he cited statistics from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The reality is that our school system, our public school system, our regular public school system, has been improving the achievements, particularly of minority students, at a phenomenal rate over recent times. I know you'll be skeptical of this because we're so convinced of this story that we never examine. The reality is that, for example, to take the most extreme example, 4th grade NAEP scores, math scores for black students, and this is the most extreme example. The average NAEP score for black students in math today, elementary school students, is higher than the average white score was 20 years ago. That's a phenomenal improvement. There's been a full standard deviation of improvement in black mathematics scores over the last 20 years. And it's almost as good in reading, and it's almost as good at the 8th grade level. So where does this idea that our schools are failing and that our regular public schools need some kind of outside stimulus to improve come from? It comes from a conviction, which I don't know where it comes from, that our system, which is in fact a quite successful system, is in a state of collapse. Now, Roland pointed out, and you've cited, everybody has cited the fact that the average charter school does not only know better, but probably a little bit worse than the average public school. And Roland has a great bell curve showing the distribution. Some charter schools do phenomenal work, and some charter schools do terrible work. But if the average is worse, then you would expect, I would think, that there's also a similar distribution among public schools. There's some public schools in the right tail that are doing phenomenal work for the same kinds of students, and some public schools in the left tail are doing phenomenal work. Why is all of our policy attention not being devoted to those public schools which are doing phenomenal work? Why aren't we wondering what can other public schools learn from the great public schools, and only worrying about what can public schools learn from charter schools? It presumably would be a lot easier to identify the characteristics of good public schools and transfer them to other public schools than it would be to identify the characteristics of good charter schools and apply them to public schools. Now, I'm not suggesting that these characteristics of great charter schools don't exist, but I'm saying we're not looking at the biggest source of ideas for improving public education, which are the public schools which are in the right tail of this distribution, and which are moving the whole distribution slightly to the right of what the distribution in charter schools are. So that's the fundamental. It's not so much, although I do have a lot of questions about the 5 characteristics that Roland mentioned, and I can go into them if you want, but the fundamental question I have is the whole context of this story, which is based on a flawed narrative about what the nature of public school education has been and is, and it's based at looking at a place which is not the most obvious place to look if we were really telling a true story about the trajectory of public education over the last 20 years.
So,
may I respond to this?
Well, yeah, no, I do want Roland to respond, and I'm going to make a comment myself. Go right ahead.
I just disagree with Richard on many things, but particularly these 2 points. Number one, if you look at average NAEP scores for 9, 13, and 17-year-olds in both math or reading over the last 30 years, they're exactly flat. You can just look at them. They're exactly flat. Number two, why did we use charter schools instead of public schools? The one thing that I do agree with you on is that there is substantial variance in public schools. And in fact, the same variance that exists there. I mean, Fairfield Elementary School in Richmond, Virginia is one of the best public schools I've ever seen. 99% free and reduced lunch. 100% of kids are at grade level in the core subjects. Here's the reason that we actually use charter schools. It's because, number one, if you want to correlate an outcome with the other choices that they're making, charter schools, number one, you can have a better estimate of their effectiveness because of the lottery data. It's very difficult for a traditional public school when you have their standard admissions process of public schools to actually estimate the value added of that school. Everyone should agree with that. I mean, there are lottery-based samples, which is like an experiment, and there's those that are not. I'd rather the experiment. Number two, on the right-hand side of that equation, when you want to understand that correlation, you want as much variance as you can in the types of things that schools do. So Seth says, hey, I'll just pay my teachers more. Other charter schools say, I'll pay my teachers less. Rocket Ship Charter says, I'll do stuff with technology. Other schools do this. There's a lot more variance in the charter sample on what they're actually doing. Some of it's successful. Some of it's a disaster. And we actually needed that to be able to find these correlations. So the correlations are a tremendous amount more believable, Richard, when you have, number one, a left-hand side variable that you believe in, and second, more variance on the right-hand side.
Other piece of that too is that I find it fascinating because if you know much about education at all, and you reflect back when you get to be my age and the age of some others, and maybe Richard's too young to remember this, but in 1970s, a guy named Ron Edmonds at Michigan State University and Larry Lizotte, William Bookover and others did a lot of research around effectiveness of public education. And all of their research was done in public schools. And it's kind of fascinating to me because when I first met Roland and looked at the 5 tenets he identified, I thought he's been reading Bookover and Edmonds and Lizotte's work, because a lot of what he found is exactly what they found in great public schools back in the 70s. And Larry Lizotte, Dr. Edmonds, of course, is passed on, but Dr. Lizotte's still doing that work, and he has an effective school network, and a lot of good public schools use that and use those strategies to improve their schools today. So I don't see the work as just, well, this is just something from charter schools. To me, this is something that works. And you have to ask yourself the hard question, I mean, what kind of rocket science is it that you need an effective teacher in every classroom? Do you have to be brilliant to realize you have to have a great principal leading every school if you want a great school? How many of us have ever seen a truly great school without a reasonably good principal? I've been doing this a long time. I can't think of once. So this stuff is not really magic. The hard piece for me is why it takes so much political will to do what we know. It's not that we don't know what works. It's not that we don't know that you talk about funding. You know, we're spending about $6,000 per student in Houston. We don't spend $13,000. Give me $13,000 and I won't go raise money either. And I'll pay my teachers $75,000 a year too. I mean, come on. This is not rocket science. But it is hard political work. The political will to meet the needs of children whose needs have never been met is tremendously hard.
Seth, I want to give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, I mean, Richard's argument to me is incredibly frustrating, and it's personal, honestly. And it's because Jade and Omar are sitting here, and their statistical likelihood of graduating high school in New York would be less than 50% right now. And we can't, as a country, sit around and say that's okay, and we're making progress, and now it's 52. Like, that's not okay. We have to take a totally different look at what we're doing in public education, rethink it, and say, how are we going to take the things that we found in pockets, in small, isolated places, and figure out how to get them to millions of kids who need them. And that is a massive challenge. None of us are underestimating the size of this challenge. All I'm trying to argue is that we actually have some really good indications of what those elements are. I had an IEP in New York City Public Schools. I went to New York City Public Schools from K to 12. The statistical likelihood of me graduating with a Regents diploma at the time was 5%. 5% of kids with IEPs graduated, special education students, from New York City Public Schools with the Regents diploma. And I went on to do well, to graduate from high school and had the luck of having great teachers and great principals. That is not something that should be determined by luck of a lottery, luck of who you're born to and your parents, luck of what school you go to, or luck of where your zip code is. It should be that the tenets of high-performing schools are in public schools across the nation, traditional public schools and public charter schools, and we're giving parents the choice to pick what's the best for them. So I'll say just one last thing, which is we decided last year to try to understand turnaround, because what we've done so far is started up schools with our model. And Secretary Duncan challenged us in the charter sector to turn around low-performing schools. And so we had the lowest performing school in Harlem, a school called Harlem Day. It was in the bottom 1 percentile of New York City public schools overall. And we took that school over, and we applied these 5 characteristics, the ones that Roland's found and Democracy Prep has used for the last 7 years. And this year, we will be in the 96th percentile citywide. We kept the same students with the same poverty and the same parents in the same building. And what we did was we changed the name on the door, the adults in the building, the leaders and the teachers, we changed most of them, and we implemented these 5 characteristics. And now those same kids are at the 96th percentile. So we can't say anymore this is impossible. We shouldn't even say this is improbable. We should say that we expect that this is predictable and possible for every child in America, and that we have an obligation to give it to them instead of letting us get off the hook by saying it's hard and we're spending more money on special ed. We should say this money is there, the resources are there, and we have to create the political will and get the talent there so that it actually transforms the lives of millions of kids and not just the thousands that I'm lucky enough to serve.
I really don't want to turn this into, we don't have a lot of time left, so I don't want to turn this into a debate about Richard's points of view, because that would take a long time. I want to ask, although I must say I'd like to know more about it, but I want to ask about something you just raised, Seth and Terry, and Roland's paper raised. This is a difficult issue, but let's talk about it. You just said you had to replace the adults in the school. And as Roland's paper says, relative to the 20 schools involved in the experiment, that's also the case. Okay, so let's talk about that. And I'll just ask each of you to talk about it. So, Terry, why was that necessary?
A lot of it had to do, quite frankly, about values and beliefs, and believing that these children that are attending these schools can learn at high levels. And when we interviewed and asked the teachers a litany of different questions and they were situational interview questions that the New Teacher Project out of New York helped us come up with. It was fascinating. The one question that had the highest correlation to student growth was this question. If we kept you on this faculty to help us turn this school around, which of your 5 colleagues would you insist that we also try to keep at all cost? And the more frequent that we had a faculty member's name included in that list, there was a higher correlation between that teacher's past ability to get kids to grow 1 or more years academically. So what that told us quickly is that teachers know who the other good teachers are. They know who the teachers are that get good results. We also know that students and parents know that as well. So what we found is in one of our schools where we replaced 82% of the teachers and kept 18%, the following year we hired an outstanding principal and brought some good teachers on. That following year we turned over 23% of those teachers. We didn't get it all right the first time.
So I would say that the surveys and the attitudes of the teachers were huge. If you just correlate their answers on these things, when teachers said things like, what I need is more support, what I need is a principal and an instructional leader, their growth under this model was pretty tremendous for the teachers, and there were just a handful of them, but it's just drives me crazy. We asked a question, what do you need to, what do you think you need to turn this school around? A handful of people just said, we need smarter kids. And that kind of stuff drives me nuts. But what I really learned in Houston and Denver, and I think this is a really, really important, at least growth for me and potential takeaway here, is you cannot cut your way to excellence. It's just not going to happen. There's a lot of rhetoric in ed reform now that says if you just cut the teachers, you can open up a magical drawer of effective teachers, pull them out and stick them in. I have not been able to find that magical drawer. If you know where it is, could you please let me know? What I have found is that, in our turnarounds, if folks, or for whatever reason, just don't think kids can learn, that's difficult to work around. But if they do believe that all kids can learn, but don't have the support and the skills to do this work, then professional development and just tremendous support for the teachers can be very, very effective. And Seth is even doing a turnaround now where they're not replacing the teachers and just doing tremendous amounts of work on the professional development side. So I think you just can't cut your way to excellence. There's no easy ways around this. We have to develop our good teachers and make them great teachers.
We need to let the people in the audience ask questions, but just make one quick comment on that.
Yeah, well, Roland alluded to it. So I was fascinated by this work we did at the turnaround at Harlem Prep, which is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my career. And we decided to try this again with a low-performing charter school that was on the cusp of being closed, and said, you know, let's change the leader, let's change the curriculum, the professional development schedule, the democracy prep model, but let's keep the teachers in place, that we're the lowest performing school. And let's see how that goes. We're in the middle of that right now. I don't know yet how it's going. I'm optimistic. I feel very good, but you know, invite me back in a year and we'll see how that school has gone, where we've tried to change and develop the good teachers and even some of the bad teachers into good teachers and take the good ones to be great. And I think we're going to have some exciting things to share.
All right, let's have some questions from the audience in our remaining time. Yes, sir, here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Mark Nadell. I have a question for Seth. You said that the issue is not money, it's talent. But isn't the problem of talent also one of money, to attract more of the bright, highly motivated graduates of colleges to go into teaching, that Teach for America will take them for 2 years, but then they want to have a viable family life, or at least some of them. And my understanding is those teachers are incredibly dedicated, 24/7, they're available, they need a break. If you could pay them more, you could attract more people in and presumably keep them on more, because you could add additional assistance for them.
Yep.
So money is an issue?
So if I had to do what Terry does and do it on $8,000 a kid, it would be tough to pay the salaries I pay. New York has a different cost of living, and so we're able to pay our teachers incredibly well and attract great talent. So it's not to say that money doesn't matter, it's how you spend the money that exists that matters. So what we do is we build a longevity incentive model, which basically gives our teachers raises every year based on their performance. Not bonuses, but raises. So our highest performing teachers make a 10% year-over-year raise. And what that means is if you stay with us for 10 years, you're going to make $125,000 as a teacher at Democracy Prep. That's pretty good, right? We can afford that on public dollars that are right now in our system, not adding any new money in. And the model is not that complex. It's not rocket science. I didn't need Roland to figure this out, right? I didn't need the MacArthur or anything else. Like, this is math. This is President Clinton said this, right? This is arithmetic. And we can take that money we're spending in the country, $250,000 a year for 25 kids, and spend it more thoughtfully to get great teachers who want to come into the profession and stay in the profession. Our teachers don't work 24/7. They work a hard job. They work from 7:45 to 5:30 in the afternoon. Find me a doctor or a lawyer in this country who doesn't work about that difficult, hard work, right?
Do they take phone calls at home?
They can, and that's up to them, but they can. We give them a BlackBerry and an iPhone so that they can choose to if they want to. But at the end of the day, those are marginal, right? Those are tiny. They don't even show up in a study like Roland's, right? The phone calls home. It's symbolic. It's about saying to a child and a family, there's no excuses for you not doing your homework. Why didn't you do your homework? You could have called me, right? That's not actually what makes the difference. It's the expectation that you'll do your homework and that there's no reason for you not to show up the next day without it.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to...
Hold on for a second. Let's get the microphone.
Hi, my name is Cece Grant. I work for a congressman in metropolitan Detroit. I'd like to touch on something that Roland Fryer said regarding not being able to cut your way to excellence. It's really good when you're in a pilot program, such as a charter school, being able to cherry pick the best teachers. But when we're talking about taking the success on charter and making it large scale, rolling it over to a public school, how do you get the best teachers, or how do you motivate the teachers who are already in the system when you can't cherry pick the best? I'd like for either one of you to address that question,
Yeah,
please.
it's tough. We just this past year in Houston implemented a training program teaching all of our kindergarten, first and second grade teachers how to teach disadvantaged children to read. It's a very intensive 5-day training program. Then this year we're going to implement the training, and the next year we're going to do 5 more days of training. And the program we're paying for, It was optional for teachers. It was very fascinating. We've taken a first deep dive look at who's gone through the training over the summer and who signed up for the training for a semester. And what's fascinating, and this won't surprise a lot of people, our teachers who got the very best results in the past 2-3 years, those are the teachers who quickly stepped up and went through the training. Some of our very lowest performing teachers, for whatever reason, did not go through the summer training, had not gone through training as of yet. And again, a lot of that comes into values and beliefs and behaviors. It's in many of the situations in public schools where you're dealing with unions, you have a difficult time demanding and requiring teachers to go through training, even when you're paying them reasonably sized stipends to do that. Seth's place, when he says you're going through training, you're going through training.
So your point is exactly right. So you can't take Democracy Prep to scale right now because we select the top 1% of people that apply to us, right? I mean, that's unheard of in public education to be able to say that that's the kind of teachers we could expect in New York City public schools with 80,000 teachers. So what we have to do is change two things. One is the way we train, prepare, and pipeline teachers. And that's something that is fundamentally broken, top to bottom in this country, is the pipeline and the training of teachers coming into the profession. That's why we're doing this pilot with keeping the teachers that are in place. But the second thing, and then Dennis mentioned this earlier, is about Finland. And there's two trains of thought on the way to think about international comparisons. There's the Finland people who think that that's the model. And Finland has always been rich. They're still rich. They're going to stay rich, right? What our model is much more like South Korea. South Korea was one of the poorest nations in Asia just 60 years ago. It was colonized 60 years. It's still at war, technically. And what they did is they elevated the teaching profession to the highest stature. They said teachers are golden. In America, we give titles to military, to clergy, to elected officials. What do we give to teachers? Yo miss, yo mister, right? In Korea, you're Sunsingnim. It is an honored and valued and esteemed profession so that everybody in college thinks about being a professor, being a teacher. Not because of the money, but because there is honor and prestige and respect in the profession of teaching. And we need to bring that to the country, and if we did that, we would see a pipeline change in who the teachers are in American classrooms, and that would change the game.
I might point out that Finland has approximately 4 million people, and it's a rather homogeneous society.
But real quickly, Korea's homogeneous too, right? This isn't about diversity per se. What I'd say at Democracy Prep should apply to every kid in America. We serve Black and Latino kids primarily, but this is good for everybody, right? More time, higher rigor, better culture, more data. Like that's not bad for middle-class white kids. That's good for everybody in the country. It's just that the kids who need us most are the 3 million that Roland's talking about.
No, I'm just pointing out that comparing the United States in any real respect to Finland is not really. Yes, sir, in the back.
Steve Crawford, George Washington Institute of Public Policy. Terry Grier emphasizes that one size won't fit all, and you have to have individualized tutoring and all sorts of interventions, and yet most of the programs we're talking about and the interventions and lessons learned are for application within one school. I've not heard much about variation among schools and allowing, the way Richard Kallenberg suggested in All Together Now, this is a Century Foundation researcher, public school choice, where ideally over time one school would be maybe the all-boys school, which is best for some kids, or the school where they wear uniforms, or the math and science school, or the arts and drama school, and parents have choice. We know where they do this. Most parents 95% get their first choice school. I'd like to hear the panel's comments on the role of public school choice.
So I did not set you up for this question. We just met earlier. Houston Independent School District is an open enrollment district. You can attend any school in the district in so long as you can get transportation there and the principal decides to accept you. We have one of the best magnet school programs in the country. Choice is huge in our school district. But at the same time, what happens, one of the challenges that we have and the struggles we have is what happens to the schools that no one chooses. What happens to those neighborhood schools? We have one of our high schools now that at one time had as many as 1,400 students. It now is down to about 500 students. It's one of our Apollo schools. It's now 34% special education. It's a huge challenge at that school, a huge challenge. So choice is good. Choice is good if you're the one who gets the choice. But there's what happens when you're left in an isolated school and you're left there. And what happens when that school is not performing at high levels. So we have all kinds of choice. We have all kinds of programs. We have an all-boys school. We have an all-girls school. We think we have the finest performing and visual arts school in America. We think we have the finest school that produces kids that go on to be doctors. DeBakey is a wonderful medical prep school. And I could go on and on and on. Lamar High School gave out more international baccalaureate diplomas last year than any public or private school in the country that we could find. We have a lot of great choice schools, and parents can choose to go wherever they want. But the real question is, what about the schools that no one is choosing? Those failing schools didn't become failing last year.
I hope this panel illustrated how important this issue is. Charters and all of the implications and the debate about charters. I want to thank Roland especially for the paper that you did, which I found brilliant, and really appreciate, Roland, the work you've done with us. I want to, of course, thank Terry and Seth and Richard. Richard, I promise you'll have another opportunity to expand upon your point of view. But thank you all, and we're going to take a short break. 5 minutes? A short break. And then we're going to proceed to the third panel.